Picture this. You're 23 years old, fresh out of college, with dreams bigger than the small mountain town you call home. You've never faced real danger, never had to fight for your life. Never imagined that a simple weekend hiking trip could become a battle between life and death that would test every fiber of your being. Sarah Martinez thought she knew what challenge meant. She'd conquered final exams, survived heartbreak, and even managed to land her dream job as a wildlife photographer, despite everyone saying it was impossible. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for what would happen on that crisp October morning when she decided to venture into the remote wilderness of the Colorado Rockies alone. What started as a quest to capture the perfect shot of wildlife in their natural habitat would become a harrowing tale of survival that would push her beyond every limit she thought she had. This is the story of how a young woman's determination to never give up, even when death seems certain, would inspire millions and prove that the human spirit can overcome the impossible. Some stories are about triumph, some are about loss. This is about both. And the thin line between giving up and holding on that makes all the difference in the world. Sarah Martinez had always been drawn to the wild places where most people feared to tread. Growing up in Denver, she spent her weekends exploring the foothills with her father, learning to read animal tracks, identify bird calls, and respect the untamed beauty of nature. Her camera had been her constant companion since she turned 16, capturing moments that others missed in their hurried lives. At 23, fresh from completing her degree in wildlife photography at Colorado State University, Sarah was determined to make her mark in a field dominated by men twice her age. Her portfolio was impressive, but she knew that to really stand out, she needed something extraordinary. Something that would capture the raw, unfiltered essence of wildlife in its purest form. The opportunity came in the form of a magazine assignment from National Wildlife Monthly. They wanted photos of the elusive mountain lions that roamed the remote wilderness areas of the Rocky Mountain National Park. It was dangerous work, the kind that seasoned photographers with decades of experience usually handled. But Sarah had convinced the editor, Tom Richardson, that her youth and agility would be assets in tracking these magnificent predators. "You sure about this, Martinez?" Tom had asked during their final meeting, his weathered face creased with concern. "These cats don't mess around." Last photographer who went after them came back empty-handed and swore he'd never try again. Sarah had smiled, with the confidence that only comes from being young and believing you're invincible. "I've been tracking animals my whole life. I can handle it." Now, standing at the edge of the wilderness area with her pack loaded with enough supplies for 5 days, Sarah felt the first flutter of doubt in her stomach. The forest stretched endlessly before her, a maze of towering pines, rocky outcrops, and hidden valleys where anything could happen. The morning mist clung to the trees like ghostly fingers, and the silence was so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. She checked her gear one final time. Camera equipment, telephoto lenses, camping supplies, food for 5 days, water purification tablets, first aid kit, GPS device, satellite phone, and her grandfather's old hunting knife that she'd never actually used for anything more serious than opening packages. Everything was accounted for, everything was perfect. The first day went exactly as planned. Sarah followed game trails deep into the wilderness, setting up motion-activated cameras at strategic points where she'd noticed signs of big cat activity. Paw prints in the soft earth, claw marks on trees, and the remains of deer kills all pointed to an active mountain lion territory. As evening approached, she made camp in a small clearing beside a babbling creek. The sound of running water was comforting, and she felt proud of how smoothly everything had gone. She prepared a simple meal of pasta and canned sauce, heated over her portable camp stove, and reviewed the photos she'd taken throughout the day on her camera's display screen. The images were good, but they weren't extraordinary. Landscape shots, some birds, a few deer in the distance. Nothing that would make Tom Richardson sit up and take notice. She needed to go deeper, find the places where the mountain lions actually lived and hunted. That night, as she lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds of the forest, Sarah felt more alive than she had in months. This was what she was meant to do. She was certain of it. The city felt like a distant memory, with its traffic and noise and endless distractions. Out here, everything was pure and real and immediate. She woke before dawn to the sound of something moving through the bushes near her campsite. Her heart hammered as she lay perfectly still, listening. Whatever it was moved with purpose, not the random wandering of a deer or elk. This was something that knew exactly where it was going. Slowly, carefully, Sarah reached for her camera. If this was what she hoped it was, she couldn't miss the opportunity. She eased the zipper of her tent down inch by inch, trying not to make any sound. The creature that emerged into the clearing took her breath away. It was a massive mountain lion, easily 6 feet long, not counting its tail, with muscles that rippled beneath its tawny coat. The big cat moved with the fluid grace that only comes from being a perfect predator, every step calculated and purposeful. Sarah's hands trembled as she raised her camera, adjusting the settings for the low light conditions. Through the telephoto lens, she could see every detail of the magnificent animal. Its amber eyes, alert and intelligent, its powerful shoulders and haunches, the way it held its head as it scanned the clearing, testing the air for scents. The mountain lion paused directly in front of her tent, not 30 feet away. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah was certain it had detected her presence. Their eyes met through the camera lens, and she felt a primal fear that went back to humanity's earliest days, when big cats like this one hunted their ancestors. But instead of approaching or showing aggression, the mountain lion simply continued on its way, disappearing into the forest as silently as it had appeared. Sarah lowered her camera, realizing she'd been holding her breath for what felt like minutes. When she checked her shots, her heart sank. The lighting had been too poor, and most of the images were too dark or blurry to use professionally. She'd had the encounter of a lifetime, and she had nothing to show for it. The second day brought more challenges. Following what she hoped were fresh mountain lion tracks, Sarah pushed deeper into the wilderness than she'd originally planned. The terrain grew rougher, with steep climbs over rocky ridges and careful descents into narrow valleys, where the sun barely penetrated the canopy of trees. By afternoon, she realized she was no longer entirely certain where she was. The GPS device showed her location as a dot on a green screen, but the landscape around her didn't match what she'd expected from studying the maps. Everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, more trees. She'd been so focused on following the animal signs that she hadn't paid enough attention to marking her own trail. An experienced hiker would have stopped right there, retraced their steps to familiar territory, and regrouped. But Sarah was driven by something stronger than caution. She was so close to getting the shots she needed, she could feel it. The signs were getting fresher, more frequent. There were scrapes in the bark of trees where a big cat had marked its territory, and she'd found scat that couldn't be more than a day old. As the sun began to set, Sarah found herself in a narrow canyon, with steep walls on both sides. A small stream ran down the middle, and she could see what looked like a cave or large crevice in the rock face ahead. It was exactly the kind of place a mountain lion might use as a den. She approached carefully, camera ready, trying to stay downwind so her scent wouldn't alert any animals that might be nearby. The cave mouth was larger than it had appeared from a distance, easily big enough for a person to walk into upright. Sarah peered into the darkness, wishing she had brought a more powerful flashlight. That's when she heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very walls of the canyon. Sarah froze, every muscle in her body suddenly tense. The sound came again, deeper this time, and definitely from inside the cave. She raised her camera, switching on the flash, and took a shot into the darkness. The brief illumination revealed golden eyes reflecting back at her from perhaps 20 feet inside the cave. Not one pair of eyes, but 3. A mother mountain lion with 2 nearly grown cubs, and Sarah had just announced her presence in the most dramatic way possible. The big cats didn't attack immediately, but Sarah could see them shifting in the darkness, moving closer to the mouth of the cave. She took a step backward, then another. Her foot slipped on the wet rocks beside the stream, and she stumbled, her camera strap catching on a branch as she fell. When she tried to stand up, pain shot through her left ankle like an electric shock. She'd twisted it badly in the fall, maybe broken it. The camera had fallen into the stream and was making an ominous clicking sound that suggested serious damage. And the mountain lions were still in the cave, still watching her, still deciding whether she was a threat worth dealing with. Sarah tried to put weight on her injured ankle and nearly collapsed again. The pain was incredible, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that she was at least a full day's hike from her car, in terrain that would be difficult to navigate even with 2 good legs. The sun was setting, the temperature was dropping, and she was alone in the territory of 3 large predators who might decide she was worth removing from their home. For the first time since leaving civilization, Sarah felt the cold touch of real fear, not the exciting fear that comes with adventure, but the kind that comes with understanding that you might actually die. She fumbled for the satellite phone in her pack, hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. The device powered on, searched for a signal, and displayed a message that made her heart sink. No satellite coverage in this location. The canyon walls were too high, blocking the signal she needed to call for help. She was truly on her own. As darkness fell over the canyon, Sarah made herself as comfortable as possible against a large boulder, her injured ankle elevated and wrapped with strips torn from her spare shirt. The mountain lions had retreated deeper into their cave, but she could still occasionally see the reflection of their eyes when she shined her flashlight in that direction. She had enough food for 3 more days, assuming she could make it last. Water wasn't a problem with the stream right beside her, but her ankle was swelling badly, and she was beginning to suspect the injury was more serious than a simple sprain. The night sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the narrow canyon. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, every distant howl made her heart race. She dozed fitfully, starting awake every few minutes, convinced that something was approaching her makeshift camp. When dawn finally broke, Sarah realized that her situation had gone from challenging to potentially life-threatening. Her ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size overnight, and the pain was so intense that she couldn't put any weight on it at all. The camera was definitely ruined, full of stream water and making grinding sounds when she tried to turn it on. But those weren't the most immediate problems. The most immediate problem was that she could hear voices echoing down the canyon. Human voices. And they were getting closer. At first, she felt a surge of relief. Other hikers meant rescue, meant help, getting back to civilization and proper medical care for her ankle. She called out, her voice cracking from thirst despite the stream water she'd been drinking. Help! I'm hurt, down here. The voices stopped, then resumed, closer now. Sarah could make out individual words, though she couldn't understand the language being spoken. It didn't sound like English, or Spanish, or any language she recognized. When the first figure appeared at the rim of the canyon above her, Sarah felt her relief turn to confusion, then to a new kind of fear. The man looking down at her wasn't dressed like a hiker or backpacker. He wore military-style clothing and camouflage patterns, and even from a distance she could see that he was carrying a rifle. More figures joined him at the canyon rim. At least 4 men, all armed, all looking down at her with expressions she couldn't read. One of them called down to her in accented English. "You are alone?" "Yes," Sarah answered, though something in the man's tone made her wish she'd lied. "I'm hurt, my ankle. I need help getting out of here." The men had a brief conversation in their own language, pointing at her and gesturing toward different parts of the canyon. Sarah caught only fragments, but she heard the word problème several times, which she recognized as French for problem. That's when she realized that these men weren't legitimate hunters or hikers. The way they moved, the way they carried their weapons, the way they'd gone silent when she first called out. Everything about them suggested people who had good reason to avoid contact with other Americans in the wilderness. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. None of them good. Drug runners using the remote wilderness to transport their product. Poachers hunting illegally in protected areas. Or worse, people involved in activities she didn't even want to think about. One of the men began climbing down into the canyon, using a rope that the others lowered for him. As he approached, Sarah could see that he was older than the others, with graying hair and cold, calculating eyes. When he spoke, his English was better than his companions, but still heavily accented. "You are a photographer, yes?" He gestured toward her damaged camera. "What you photograph here?" Sarah's throat felt dry despite the stream water she'd been drinking. "Just wildlife. Nature photography. I'm doing an assignment for a magazine." The man picked up her camera, examining it with the kind of attention that suggested he knew something about photography equipment. He turned it over in his hands, pressing buttons and frowning at the damage. "This camera, it still work?" "No, it fell in the water. Everything's ruined." He called up to his companions in their own language, and Sarah heard what sounded like an argument. Finally, he turned back to her. "You come with us. We help with ankle." It wasn't really a request, and Sarah knew it. But what choice did she have? She couldn't walk out of the canyon on her own, and leaving her here would mean either slow death from exposure and starvation, or quick death from the mountain lions who still occupied the cave across the stream. "Where are we going?" she asked, as the man began improvising a splint for her ankle using branches and strips of cloth. "Somewhere safe," he replied. But there was something in his eyes that suggested his definition of safe might be very different from hers. As the other men lowered more rope and prepared to haul her up out of the canyon, Sarah looked back at the cave where the mountain lions waited. Part of her wondered if she should have taken her chances with the big cats instead. The predators, she understood. These men, with their guns and their secrets and their reasons for being in the middle of nowhere where no one would ever find them, were a completely different kind of dangerous. And she was about to become their problem to solve. The journey out to the canyon was a nightmare of pain and growing dread. Sarah found herself strapped to an improvised stretcher made from branches and rope, carried by two of the armed men, while the others scouted ahead and behind. Every jolt sent waves of agony through her damaged ankle, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the fear that grew stronger with each mile they traveled deeper into the wilderness. The men moved with military precision, following paths that weren't marked on any map Sarah had ever seen. They communicated in hand signals and whispered words in what she now believed was French, though mixed with other languages she couldn't identify. Whatever they were involved in, it required them to remain hidden from the outside world. After what felt like hours of being carried through increasingly rough terrain, they arrived at a camp that took Sarah's breath away. Hidden in a natural bowl surrounded by towering pines, a collection of military-style tents and camouflage structures created a temporary base that could house dozens of people. Solar panels provided power for communications equipment, and she could see weapon caches covered with waterproof tarps. The man who had climbed down into the canyon to retrieve her, the one the others called Baptiste, helped transfer her from the stretcher to a cot inside one of the larger tents. Despite her fear, Sarah had to admit that they were treating her injured ankle with professional care. Baptiste had clearly received medical training, cleaning and rebandaging her injury with supplies that were far better than anything in her first aid kit. "You are lucky," Baptiste said as he worked. "The bone she is not broken. But the ligaments, they are very damaged. You cannot walk for many days." "What do you want with me?" Sarah asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Baptiste paused in his work, studying her face with those cold, calculating eyes. "That is not for me to decide. We wait for instructions." The implications of that statement sent a chill through Sarah's body. Instructions from whom? And what kind of instructions might they be waiting for regarding a young American woman who had stumbled into whatever operation they were running? Over the next 2 days, Sarah learned more about her captors through careful observation and the fragments of conversation she could understand. They were definitely not Americans, and from what she could piece together, they were involved in some kind of smuggling operation that required them to remain hidden in the remote wilderness for weeks at a time. The camp operated like a military unit, with established routines for everything from meal preparation to security patrols. Sarah counted at least 12 men, all armed, all clearly experienced in wilderness survival and combat operations. Whatever they were smuggling, it was valuable enough to justify this level of organization and risk. Baptiste seemed to be in command of the day-to-day operations, but it became clear that he was waiting for orders from someone higher up the chain. Sarah noticed him checking the satellite communication device several times each day, frowning at whatever messages he received. On her third day in the camp, everything changed. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of urgent voices and equipment being packed. Through the walls of her tent, she could see flashlight beams moving frantically as the men broke down their camp with practiced efficiency. Whatever they had been waiting for had happened. Baptiste appeared at her tent opening, his face grim. "We move in 1 hour. Your government, they are looking for you." Sarah's heart leapt with hope. Someone had noticed she was missing. Tom Richardson, maybe, or her parents when she failed to check in as promised. Search and rescue teams were probably combing the wilderness, getting closer to finding this hidden camp, but her hope was short-lived when she saw the expression on Baptiste's face. "This is very bad for all of us," he continued. "Search helicopters, ground teams, dogs. They make too much noise, bring too much attention to our operation." "Then let me go," Sarah said quickly. "Drop me somewhere they'll find me, and you can disappear before anyone knows you are here." Baptiste shook his head. "Is not so simple. You have seen too much, know too much about this place. My superior, he is not happy about this situation." The cold knot of fear in Sarah's stomach grew tighter. She had become a liability to these men, and in their world, liabilities were dealt with permanently. "What are you going to do with me?" "We take you with us to the extraction point." After that, Baptiste shrugged, but there was something in his eyes that might have been sympathy. "After that, we see what orders come." The next few hours were chaos as the camp was completely dismantled, leaving virtually no trace that it had ever existed. Sarah found herself once again strapped to a stretcher, but this time the men carrying her moved with desperate urgency. They were running from something, and her presence was slowing them down. The terrain they covered was some of the most brutal Sarah had ever seen. Steep climbs over rocky ridges, careful descents into valleys where one wrong step could mean a fatal fall, and stretches of thick forest where progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Her ankle throbbed constantly, but she forced herself not to complain. These men were stressed and dangerous, and giving them any excuse to see her as more trouble than she was worth could be fatal. By afternoon, it became clear that they were being pursued. Baptiste called frequent stops to listen for helicopter sounds, and twice they had to take cover under thick tree cover as aircraft passed overhead. The search was getting closer, and the men were getting more nervous. That's when Sarah made a decision that would either save her life or end it. During one of their rest stops, while the men were distracted by radio chatter about the search activities, Sarah managed to work one hand free from the restraints that held her to the stretcher. Hidden in her jacket pocket was the emergency whistle that every wilderness hiker carried. A small plastic device that could produce a sound loud enough to be heard for miles. The next time she heard helicopter rotors in the distance, Sarah made her choice. She pulled out the whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the universal distress signal. The effect was immediate and violent. Baptiste spun toward her, his face twisted with rage, while the other men scrambled for their weapons. But the damage was done. The helicopter sounds changed direction, clearly responding to her signal. "Stupid girl," Baptiste snarled, grabbing the whistle from her hand and crushing it underfoot. "You have killed us all." For a moment, Sarah thought he might actually shoot her right there. His hand went to the pistol at his hip, and she could see the calculation in his eyes. But then the helicopter sounds grew louder, and practical considerations overrode his anger. "Move. Everyone move," he shouted to his men. "Leave the heavy equipment. We go to the backup extraction point." What followed was a nightmare chase through some of the most dangerous terrain in the Colorado Rockies. The men abandoned Sarah's stretcher, forcing her to move on her own despite her injured ankle. Baptiste grabbed her arm and half-carried, half-dragged her through thick underbrush and over treacherous rock faces. The helicopter was definitely tracking them now, occasionally appearing overhead through breaks in the forest canopy. Sarah could see it was a Colorado search and rescue aircraft, painted bright orange and white, with rescue in large letters on its side. Every time it appeared, her heart soared with hope, but the men kept forcing her to move, staying under tree cover whenever possible. Hours passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Sarah's ankle felt like it was on fire, and she was sure she was making the injury worse with every step. But the alternative, being shot and left for the animals, was far worse than any amount of physical pain. As the sun began to set, they reached what Baptiste called the backup extraction point, a narrow valley with a small clearing where a helicopter could potentially land. Sarah could see tire tracks in the dirt, suggesting that vehicles had been here recently. But something was wrong. The clearing was empty, and Baptiste's radio calls were going unanswered. "Where is the transport?" one of the other men demanded in heavily accented English. Baptiste tried the radio again, his face growing darker with each failed attempt to make contact. Finally, he threw the device to the ground in frustration. "The operation is compromised. They have abandoned us." Sarah watched the men's faces as the full implications of their situation sank in. They were stranded in the wilderness, being hunted by search and rescue teams, with no way to contact their organization and no extraction plan. And they still had her to deal with. The discussion that followed was conducted in rapid French, but Sarah didn't need to understand the words to know they were deciding her fate. Several of the men kept gesturing in her direction, their intentions clear, even without translation. That's when Baptiste made a decision that surprised everyone, including Sarah. "We split up," he announced to his men in English. "Small groups, different directions. Better chance someone escapes." He looked directly at Sarah. "The girl stays with me. She is my responsibility." The other men didn't like this decision, and another heated argument broke out. Sarah caught enough words to understand that they wanted to eliminate the witness and travel light, but Baptiste held his ground, and eventually the group reluctantly agreed to his plan. Within an hour, Sarah found herself alone with Baptiste as the other men disappeared into the forest in pairs, heading in different directions. She watched them go with mixed feelings. They had been her captors, but they had also been the only other humans in a wilderness that was rapidly becoming deadly as night fell and the temperature dropped. "Why didn't you let them kill me?" Sarah asked as Baptiste helped her construct a shelter using branches and a camouflage tarp. Baptiste was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "I have daughter, same age as you. Photographer also in Paris." He secured another branch to their improvised lean-to. "She is stubborn like you. Always taking pictures in dangerous places, always thinking she is invincible. What's her name?" "Bad. Marie. She photographs street art, urban decay, things like that. Drives her mother crazy with worry." Baptiste managed a slight smile. I think maybe she would like your mountain lion pictures, if they had survived. For the first time since this ordeal began, Sarah felt a glimmer of human connection with her captor. He was still dangerous, still part of whatever illegal operation had brought him to these mountains, but he was also a father who missed his daughter. "The people you work for," Sarah said carefully, "what will they do when they find out you didn't follow orders?" Baptiste's expression darkened again. "They will be very displeased. But first they must find me, and I know these mountains well. We have used them for 3 years now." "What were you smuggling?" "Better you don't know. Some things, once you know them, they cannot be unknown." They spent the night huddled together for warmth in their improvised shelter, listening to the sounds of search helicopters in the distance. Sarah's ankle was swelling again, and she was beginning to develop a fever from infection or exhaustion. Baptiste shared his emergency medical supplies and food, treating her with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything she knew about him. When dawn broke, they could hear voices in the forest, much closer than the helicopter sounds. The ground search teams were closing in, and Baptiste knew it. "Listen to me carefully," he said, checking his weapon and preparing to leave their shelter. "The rescue teams, they will find you today, maybe in few hours. You tell them you were alone, that you got lost and injured. You never saw anyone else in these mountains. What about you?" "I disappear," is what I do best." Baptiste slung his pack over his shoulders and prepared to leave. "You remember what I said. You were alone. Always alone." "Wait," Sarah called as he started to walk away. "Your daughter, Marie. Tell her that her pictures matter. Tell her that taking risks for something you believe in is worth it, even when it gets scary." Baptiste paused, his back still turned to her. "She would like you, I think. You both have the same, fire in your eyes." And then he was gone, disappearing into the forest with the silent efficiency of a man who had spent years staying invisible. Sarah never saw him again. 2 hours later, she heard the distinctive sound of search dogs barking, getting closer. When the first rescue worker appeared through the trees, Sarah felt a relief so intense it left her shaking. She was found. She was safe. She was going home. But as the medical team worked to stabilize her ankle and prepare her for helicopter evacuation, Sarah realized that her real test of survival was just beginning. She had to decide what story to tell, what truth to reveal, and how to live with the knowledge of what she had witnessed in the deep wilderness. The mountain lions seemed like a much simpler problem in comparison. The helicopter ride to Denver General Hospital passed in a blur of medical procedures and concerned voices. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her body finally allowing exhaustion and pain to overwhelm her now that safety was assured. Through the aircraft's windows, she caught glimpses of the vast wilderness she had barely survived, looking deceptively peaceful from above. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of medical examinations, police interviews, and worried family members. Sarah's parents flew in from Phoenix, her mother crying with relief while her father tried to hide his own tears behind gruff questions about her carelessness. Tom Richardson from National Wildlife Monthly visited twice, bringing flowers and assurances that the magazine would cover all her medical expenses. But through it all, Sarah maintained the story Baptiste had coached her to tell. She had been hiking alone, gotten lost, injured her ankle, and spent several days surviving on her own until the rescue teams found her. The destroyed camera supported her narrative. Equipment failures in the wilderness were common enough that no one questioned why she had no photos from her adventure. The only person who seemed skeptical was Detective Maria Santos from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in wilderness crimes. "It's remarkable that you survived for 5 days with that ankle injury," Detective Santos commented during their third interview. "Most people in your situation would have developed serious complications much sooner." "I guess I was lucky," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, very lucky. We found your campsite from the first night, and the tracks around it were interesting. Professional searchers noted some unusual boot prints mixed in with the animal tracks. Military-style boots, not the kind most hikers wear." Sarah's heart hammered, but she forced herself to meet the detective's gaze. "I wouldn't know anything about that. When I was injured, I was pretty focused on just staying alive." Detective Santos studied her for a long moment, then closed her notebook. "Well, the important thing is that you're safe. Though I have to say, we had reports from other agencies about unusual activity in that area. Drug interdiction folks have been tracking some concerning patterns in the remote wilderness areas." After the detective left, Sarah lay in her hospital bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made the right choice in protecting Baptiste and his men. They were criminals, involved in something dangerous and illegal. But Baptiste had also saved her life, showed her kindness when he could have simply eliminated a problem. The moral complexity of her situation became even more complicated 3 days later when Tom Richardson returned with news that changed everything. "The FBI contacted me this morning," Tom said, settling into the chair beside Sarah's bed. "Turns out your little adventure might have provided some valuable intelligence after all." Sarah's blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "They found the remains of that camp you mentioned seeing in the distance. Professional analysis suggests it was being used by international smugglers, probably moving high-value contraband through the wilderness. The feds have been trying to track these guys for years." "Did they catch anyone?" Tom shook his head. "Disappeared like smoke. But they left behind enough evidence to identify the organization, French Foreign Legion deserters working for arms dealers. Nasty people, according to the FBI. The kind who don't leave witnesses." Sarah felt sick. Arms dealers. That explained the military precision, the weapons, the extreme measures to avoid detection. Baptiste and his men weren't just smuggling drugs or stolen goods, they were trafficking in weapons that could be used to kill hundreds of people. "Sarah?" Tom's voice seemed to come from far away. "You okay? You look pale." "Just tired. The medication makes me fuzzy sometimes." But Sarah wasn't fuzzy at all. Her mind was racing, trying to process this new information. Baptiste had a daughter he loved, had shown mercy to a stranger, had risked his own life to protect her, but he was also part of an organization that supplied weapons to people who used them for violence and terrorism. The contradiction felt impossible to reconcile. Her recovery took 3 weeks, most of it spent in physical therapy relearning how to walk without crutches. The ligament damage to her ankle was severe enough that doctors warned she might always have some limitations, might never be able to handle the kind of rugged wilderness hiking that had been her passion. During the long hours of recovery, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about those days in the mountains. Not just the fear and pain, but the moments of human connection. Baptiste sharing his emergency food supplies. The way he had talked about his daughter with such obvious love and pride. The decision he made to protect her when his own men wanted to eliminate the witness. She also thought about the mountain lions in their cave, the magnificent creatures that had started this whole chain of events. In all the drama with the smugglers, she had almost forgotten why she had gone into the wilderness in the first place. The assignment from National Wildlife Monthly remained unfulfilled, the perfect shots uncaptured. 2 months after her rescue, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She was going back. "Absolutely not," her mother declared, when Sarah announced her intention to return to wilderness photography. "You nearly died out there. Find a safer career. Wedding photography. Portraits. Something that doesn't require you to risk your life." Her father was more diplomatic but equally concerned. "Honey, you're still recovering. The doctors said your ankle might never be completely normal again. Maybe it's time to consider other options." Even Tom Richardson tried to talk her out of it. "Look, Sarah, I admire your dedication, but there are plenty of photographers who can handle the dangerous assignments. You've proven yourself. You don't need to keep taking these risks." But Sarah had realized something during her long recovery. She wasn't just a photographer who happened to work in dangerous places. She was someone who needed to push boundaries, to test herself against challenges that most people would never even attempt. The experience with Baptiste and his men hadn't broken that spirit. If anything, it had made her more determined to prove that she belonged in the wild places of the world. Her first assignment after her recovery was deliberately modest. Photographing bird migration patterns in a well-traveled area of Rocky Mountain National Park. Park rangers knew her schedule. She carried multiple communication devices, and she promised to check in every 4 hours. The work felt strange at first, almost tame compared to the intensity of her previous adventure. But as she spent hours watching and photographing the seasonal movement of eagles, hawks, and countless smaller species, Sarah began to understand something new about her art. The most powerful photographs weren't necessarily the ones that required the most risk to capture. They were the ones that revealed something true about the natural world, something that most people missed because they weren't patient enough or observant enough to see it. Over the following year, Sarah's work began to gain recognition not for its danger, but for its insight. Her photographs showed animals in moments of genuine behavior, caught unaware by a photographer who had learned to move through the wilderness like a shadow. Awards followed, then gallery shows, then a book deal. But she never forgot about Baptiste and his men, or the moral complexity of her encounter with them. Late at night, she sometimes wondered what had happened to them. Had they escaped the authorities, found new smuggling routes, or had their organization decided they were too much of a liability to keep alive? The answer came 18 months after her rescue, in the form of a small news item buried in the international section of the Denver Post. French authorities had arrested several former Foreign Legion soldiers in connection with an arms trafficking ring that had been supplying weapons to terrorist groups in Africa. Among those arrested was a man identified only as Baptiste M., described as a former sergeant who had been operating out of remote wilderness areas in several countries. Sarah stared at the brief article for a long time, trying to reconcile the man described in the news with the person who had shared his food and protected her from his own men. The article mentioned that Baptiste had a family in Paris, ex-wife and daughter who claimed no knowledge of his criminal activities. Marie, the daughter who photographed street art and urban decay, who worried her mother by taking pictures in dangerous places. Sarah wondered if she had any idea what her father had been doing to support their family. That night, Sarah did something she had been thinking about for months. She created an anonymous email account and sent a message to a photography blog based in Paris, one that featured the kind of street photography that Baptiste had described his daughter doing.
The message was simple. To Marie M.
Your father wanted you to know that your pictures matter, that taking risks for something you believe in is worth it, even when it gets scary. A friend in Colorado. She never knew if the message reached its intended recipient, but sending it felt like completing a circle that had been left open for too long. 5 years after her encounter in the wilderness, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference on wilderness photography. The auditorium was filled with young photographers, mostly women, who saw her as a pioneer in a field that had traditionally been dominated by men. During the question and answer session, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. Miss Martinez, you're known for taking incredible risks to get your photographs.
What advice would you give to photographers who want to push boundaries but are worried about danger? Sarah thought carefully before answering.
The most important thing to understand is that real courage isn't about eliminating risk. It's about making intelligent choices about which risks are worth taking.
I've been in situations where I had to choose between getting the perfect shot and staying alive. Every time, staying alive was the right choice. She paused, remembering the mountain lions in their cave, Baptiste and his men, the long nights of uncertainty about whether she would ever see civilization again. But I'll also tell you this, the experiences that test us, that push us beyond what we thought we could handle, those are the ones that teach us who we really are. Some of my best work came not from the moments when everything went perfectly, but from the times when I had to dig deep and find strength I didn't know I had. Do you ever regret taking those risks? Ever wish you had chosen a safer path? Sarah smiled, thinking of her latest project, a series of photographs documenting the recovery of wilderness areas after forest fires. It was challenging work, but not dangerous in the same way her earlier adventures had been. She had learned to balance her need for authentic experiences with a more mature understanding of genuine risk. I've learned that there are different kinds of courage, she said finally. There's the courage to face external dangers, like wild animals or difficult terrain. But there's also the courage to face the complexities of human nature, to make difficult moral choices, to live with uncertainty about whether you did the right thing. The audience was quiet, sensing that she was talking about something more personal than photography techniques. The wilderness teaches you that survival isn't just about physical endurance or technical skills. It's about understanding that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones that walk on two legs. And sometimes the people who seem most dangerous might surprise you with their capacity for mercy. After her presentation, Sarah walked outside into the Colorado evening, breathing the thin mountain air and looking west toward the peaks where her real education had begun. She thought about Baptiste, probably in a French prison now, separated from the daughter he loved. She thought about his men, scattered to whatever fate awaited former soldiers who had chosen the wrong side of the law. And she thought about the mountain lions, still living in their canyon home, raising their cubs, and hunting in the ancient ways that had sustained their kind for thousands of years. They were the reason she had gone into the wilderness in the first place, and in a strange way, they were still her inspiration. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her recent photographs until she found the one she was looking for, a magnificent cougar she had captured just last month, not in some remote wilderness, but in a rehabilitation center where injured big cats learn to live again after encounters with human civilization. The photograph showed the big cat in a moment of perfect stillness, amber eyes looking directly at the camera, with an expression that seemed to hold all the wild wisdom of the mountains. It wasn't the dramatic action shot she had originally set out to capture 5 years ago, but it was something better, a portrait that revealed the dignity and resilience that allowed these creatures to survive in a world that was increasingly dominated by human activity. Sarah looked at the image for a long moment, then typed a caption, Sometimes the most important pictures aren't the ones that show us conquering nature, but the ones that remind us we're part of something larger than ourselves. She posted the photograph to her professional account, adding one final line. Don't stop. Keep going. But remember to breathe. It was advice she had learned in a canyon surrounded by predators, both animal and human, where survival had depended not just on courage, but on the wisdom to understand when fighting was necessary and when mercy was possible. The mountains had taught her that lesson, and she would carry it with her for the rest of her life, no matter where her camera led her next.